Kalamazoo State Hospital, Michigan, February 22, 1965. Morning. Louise Little sat by the window of her room watching snow fall across the flat Michigan landscape. She was 71 years old. She had lived inside these walls for 26 years. Outside, the world was in chaos. Newspapers across America were printing the name Malcolm X in bold black letters. Radio stations were broadcasting the news. Television cameras were rolling outside a ballroom in Harlem. Malcolm X, the most electrifying black voice in America, had been assassinated the previous afternoon. Shot 16 times while giving a speech. 39 years old, dead. But inside Louise's room at Kalamazoo State Hospital, none of that existed. No newspapers, no television, no radio, no visitors bringing news from outside. Just the window, the snow, the institutional sounds she had lived with for more than 2 decades. Louise Little did not know her son was dead. She did not know he had ever been famous. She did not know that while she sat in this room, watching Michigan seasons change year after year, her son had shaken the foundations of American racial politics, debated white intellectuals on national television, met world leaders, traveled to Africa and the Middle East, and become the most discussed, most feared, most celebrated and condemned black man of his generation. She did not know any of it. The state of Michigan had decided she was too fragile to know, and so she sat. And the world turned without her, and her son died without her knowing. And that silence, that deliberate, institutional, decades-long silence, is one of the quietest and most devastating acts of cruelty in Malcolm X's story. Louise Norton Little was born in 1897 in Grenada, British West Indies. She was the daughter of a black woman and a white man who never acknowledged her. That origin, mixed race, colonial, illegitimate, marked her from birth. She came to the United States as a young woman, educated far beyond what most women of her era and race were permitted to be. She spoke 4 languages. She read philosophy and political theory. She wrote articles for Marcus Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World, under a pen name because a woman with her views expressing them under her real name faced consequences. She met Earl Little, a Baptist preacher from Georgia who was also a passionate organizer for Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. They were, in the language of their time, a power couple, intellectual equals, political partners, 2 people who believed with absolute conviction that black people deserved dignity, self-determination, and the space to build something lasting on their own terms. Together they built a family in Omaha, Nebraska, and later in Lansing, Michigan. 8 children. Malcolm was the 7th, a house with a garden. A family that read aloud at the dinner table, that argued about politics, that understood itself as part of something larger than its own survival. Louise was the intellectual foundation of that family. She educated those children with a ferocity that came from knowing exactly what they were up against. She pressed them to read, to think, to speak clearly, to never accept the diminishment the world was constantly trying to impose. In another America, Louise Little would have been a professor, a journalist, an editor, a diplomat. In the America that existed, she was a black woman raising 8 children against the wind, and the wind was about to become a hurricane. The first act of destruction was Earl's death in 1931. Malcolm was 6. Earl Little was found on the streetcar tracks in Lansing, his skull crushed, his body nearly severed. The insurance company ruled suicide. Louise knew better. Earl had been threatened by white supremacists for years. The Ku Klux Klan had burned their house in Omaha before Malcolm was born. The Black Legion, a Midwest white supremacist organization, had threatened Earl repeatedly in Lansing for his Garveyite organizing. But suicide was the ruling. The insurance company used it to deny the life insurance policy that would have given Louise and her 8 children a fighting chance at stability. Louise spent years fighting that ruling, years of letters to insurance companies, appeals to welfare offices, arguments to anyone who would listen. Years of watching the case go nowhere while her children needed food, clothing, education, and a mother who wasn't consumed by a losing battle against bureaucratic indifference. She was fighting on too many fronts with no resources: grief, poverty, 8 children, a hostile system, no allies. The Great Depression had stripped away any economic margin that might have existed. Welfare workers began appearing at the house, ostensibly to help, functionally to surveil, to document, to build a case, because in the bureaucratic logic of 1930s America, a black widow with 8 children and insufficient income was not a woman in crisis who needed support. She was a problem to be managed, and managing her meant evaluating her fitness as a mother by standards that applied differently to black women than to white ones. The welfare workers documented everything: Louise's discipline methods, her emotional state, her responses to their presence, her refusal to accept certain forms of charity she found demeaning while accepting others, her episodes of distress when the grief and pressure became too much to contain. They wrote it all down. They visited frequently. They made clear they had opinions about how Louise ran her household. And gradually, over years, the file they were building reached a critical mass. By 1937 and 1938, Louise was coming apart, not from mental illness in any clinical sense that modern psychiatry would recognize, from grief, from poverty, from sustained, targeted institutional pressure applied to a woman who had no support structure and no safe place to collapse. She had moments where she lost track of conversations, episodes where she seemed unreachable, behavior that her children described as their mother struggling and that the welfare workers described as evidence of mental unfitness. The distinction between those two descriptions is the difference between compassion and cruelty. The welfare workers chose cruelty's vocabulary. In January 1939, officials arrived at the family home. There was paperwork, there was a process. Louise Little, 38 years old, was taken from her house and transported 2 hours southwest to Kalamazoo State Hospital. The diagnosis in the admission documents read, mental illness, no specificity, no treatment plan with an endpoint, just the designation that meant she stays here now. Malcolm was 13 years old. He watched them take her. He stood at the door of that house and watched his mother leave in a state vehicle and disappear down the road. And that image, that specific wound, was the origin of everything. Not the speeches, not the theology, not the political philosophy. That road, that vehicle, his mother disappearing into the state's custody while he stood there 13 and helpless and burning with a rage that would take years to find its direction. Louise's children were distributed among foster families. Some were separated from each other. The family that Earl and Louise had built, the one that read Garvey aloud and argued about black self-determination and believed in its own dignity, was dismantled by welfare paperwork and state authority. Malcolm moved from home to home through his teenage years. He eventually landed in Boston with his older half-sister Ella, who became the closest thing to a stable anchor in his drifting adolescence. But the damage was done. The family was gone. The mother was gone, and the system that had taken both had done so not with violence but with the particular cruelty of paperwork and procedure. Malcolm learned something from this that shaped everything he later said about American racism. The most sophisticated forms of oppression don't use fists. They use forms. They use diagnoses. They use case files and official language and the authority of institutions that claim to be helping while they destroy. Malcolm first visited his mother at Kalamazoo in the early 1950s after his release from prison. He was beginning to become Malcolm X, crystallizing the identity that would define him. But the visit destroyed him privately in ways he didn't show publicly. Louise was there but not fully present. 20 years of institutionalization had done their work. The medication, the routine, the complete severing from the world outside had taken the woman who had read 4 languages and written for Garvey's newspaper and compressed her into someone who lived at the surface of herself. She surfaced sometimes. The intelligence would flash through, the pride, the sharpness, the mother who had read aloud at dinner tables and insisted her children understand their own worth. Those moments were islands. Surrounded by a fog the institution had manufactured, Malcolm sat across from her during those visits and felt simultaneously grateful she was alive and devastated by the distance between who she was and who she had been. He carried that distance with him everywhere after. It was one of the private sources of his public fire. As Malcolm's fame grew through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, Louise remained at Kalamazoo in a world completely insulated from everything happening outside. While Malcolm built Temple No. 7 in Harlem into the most powerful Nation of Islam mosque in America, Louise attended institutional activities. While Malcolm appeared on national television and debated intellectuals who tried to dismiss him and found they couldn't, Louise's world was the hospital's common room. While Malcolm stood before thousands and gave speeches that made the FBI tremble and young black people feel for the first time that their rage had a name and a direction, Louise watched seasons change through her window. The cruelty of this parallel is not accidental. It is structural. The same system that destroyed Louise created the conditions that made Malcolm necessary. His mother's institutionalization wasn't a backdrop to his story, it was the engine of it. Every time Malcolm spoke about the state destroying black families, he was describing his own family's destruction. Every time he spoke about black women being stripped of their children and their dignity by a system that claimed to be helping them, he was describing Louise. The abstract became personal, became rage, became movement. When Malcolm was assassinated on February 21, 1965, the family faced an impossible question. Louise was 71 years old. She had been inside Kalamazoo for 26 years. She had survived grief, poverty, institutionalization, and the erasure of everything she had built. Did they tell her? How do you tell a woman who has already lost everything that the son she barely knew as an adult has been murdered? Family members consulted with hospital staff. The decision was made to withhold the news, to protect her, they said. The word protect is doing enormous work in that sentence. What protection means in this context is, we will continue to manage what Louise knows about the world. We will continue to be the authority that decides what reality she is permitted to experience. The institution had been making that decision for 26 years. This was just one more item in a long list of things Louise was not allowed to know. And so on February 22, 1965, while newspapers across America printed Malcolm's name in grief and anger, Louise sat by her window watching snow fall, not knowing, not grieving, protected from the knowledge that the boy she'd raised had become a legend and then a martyr while she sat in this room 2 hours from where he grew up. Louise Little was eventually released from Kalamazoo State Hospital. She had survived 26 years of institutionalization through a combination of internal resilience that the institution never fully extinguished and the particular endurance of someone who had no choice but to continue. She lived her final years outside those walls in the company of family, receiving a belated recognition of who she was and what had been done to her. When she finally visited Malcolm's grave, the family members present described the moment with difficulty. Louise stood at the headstone for a long time, not weeping, not speaking, just standing, accounting for the distance. The 26 years inside while he grew from a 13-year-old watching her disappear down a road into a man whose name meant something to millions. The years she missed, the speeches she never heard, the man she never fully knew because the state took her before. He became himself. She stood there and no words were adequate, because what do you say at the grave of a son the world knew better than you did? What do you say to the absence of someone who was everywhere while you were nowhere? Louise Little outlived Malcolm by decades. She lived long enough to hold his autobiography, to understand finally what her son had become, to feel the weight of legacy that bore his name and in its deepest origins bore hers too. She lived long enough to know that the boy who watched her disappear into a state vehicle in 1939 had spent his entire adult life trying to articulate why that disappearance was not an accident but a crime, not a personal tragedy but a systemic one. Not her failure, but the state's. She had always known this, of course, long before Malcolm named it in speeches. She had always known that what happened to her was not about her mental health, but about power, about race, about the particular vulnerability of a black woman who refused to perform gratitude for her own destruction. The state had called it illness. She had always known it was punishment. And now, late and incomplete and surrounded by grief for everything missed, the world was beginning to understand what she had always known. Her son had spent his life making sure of it. The story of Louise Little is not a footnote. It is the foundation. Without Louise, there is no Malcolm. Not because of simple biology, but because the specific quality of Malcolm's rage, its precision, its refusal to accept systemic explanations that exempted personal culpability, its insistence that the ordinary operations of American institutions were acts of violence even when no blood was shed, came directly from watching what the state did to his mother. He saw it happen. He was 13. He never forgot. And he spent the rest of his short life making sure that the people who needed to understand it could not look away. Louise Little deserved recognition in her own lifetime. She deserved to know her son was famous before he was dead. She deserved to hear his speeches and recognize her own dignity reflected in them. She deserved to know that what was taken from her was not taken in vain. She deserved so much that was denied, and that denial, quiet, institutional, documented in welfare files and hospital admission forms, is as much a part of the story of Malcolm X as any speech he gave. maybe more, because it tells us not just what he said, but why he had to say it. The parallel lives of Louise and Malcolm, one erased, one amplified, represent something deeper than personal tragedy. They represent the two faces of the same system. One face produces famous radicals. The other face produces forgotten women in institutional rooms. Both faces belong to the same body. The system that destroyed Louise created the conditions that made Malcolm necessary. His anger wasn't abstract. It wasn't philosophical at its root. It was personal and specific and sourced in a 13-year-old standing at a door watching his mother disappear. Every word Malcolm ever spoke in public about systemic racism had that image as its foundation. The welfare workers with their clipboards, the state vehicle on the road, his mother's face in the window, getting smaller, disappearing, going somewhere he could not follow. He followed as close as he could. He visited. He sent money. He wrote letters. He sat across from her in a hospital room and tried to reach the woman the institution had not completely taken. Sometimes he reached her. Sometimes he didn't. And the grief of that partial reaching, the contact that should have been full and wasn't because 20 years of institutionalization stood between them, was something Malcolm carried quietly beneath everything else he carried loudly. He was famous for his anger. He was private about this particular wound. Because some griefs are too intimate for speeches, some losses are too personal for platforms. Louise was his, not a symbol, his mother. The woman who read Garvey aloud at the dinner table and believed in her children's worth before the world gave her any reason to. She deserved everything. She received an institution, a window, Michigan snow, and a son she barely knew who shook a world she never saw.